from the past, here to talk about everything that I read in the year 2020. Man, doesn't that seem like ages ago now? Just kidding. For me, it is the 2nd of January and it feels literally like yesterday/2 days ago. That's the way that time works. So I thought I'd show you the classic booktube stack of everything that I read in 2020. So there you go. For those of you who have been around for a while, you would know that I did have the resolution. I wanted to read a book a month. I want to try to read a book a month. I wasn't really a big reader at the time when I set that goal. I didn't take it very seriously because I haven't read that much since I was probably about 15 years old. I used to be a huge reader when I was a kid and when I was a teen. That's definitely from my experience when Instagram started becoming more in the social zeitgeist. So I think that that's probably what it was, because before that, reading had been a huge part of my daily life, of my personality. So even though I did set that resolution of reading a book a month, I didn't start reading at all until July when I picked up one of the books in the stack. But that was usually my habit. I usually would read 1 or 2 books in the summertime. It wasn't until October, around my birthday when I turned 23, when I realized how much I kind of missed reading, as well as really get back to my child self. I respect my 10-year-old self. I want to be more like my 10-year-old self. So I made the decision to start reading again around then, and I managed to finish 13 physical books this year, as well as 4 audiobooks, bringing me to a total of 17 books this year, which I think is pretty good. And by no means consider myself one of those really impressive booktubers who managed to read like this amount in a month. That's fine, that's not my game. But I'm pretty happy with what I did and I managed to accomplish, and I definitely think that I have incorporated reading permanently into my lifestyle. So now that I've explained that, let's go through what I did read this year. So I want to start off by talking about the main chunk of this list, which is the Sisters Grimm series by Michael Buckley. These are my favorite books when I was about 12 years old. I absolutely fell in love with them. They have been a staple on my shelf for ages. It is a middle grade contemporary fantasy series. It follows the lives of Sabrina and Daphne, who become orphans when their parents go missing one rainy night in New York City. From then, they bounce around in the foster system for a bit before landing in the care of a woman who's claiming to be their grandmother in this very mysterious little town called Fairyport Landing. That is when they find out that not only are they the descendants of the Brothers Grimm, the stories that the Brothers Grimm have written about are actually true. Their job is to record the stories and solve the mysteries that all the fairy tale characters get up to. I know not everybody's a fan of reading middle grade as an adult, and that is just fine. Honestly, reading these back, they were not as thrilling as they were when I was a kid. But that being said, they were something really easy to slip into when I didn't feel like reading. They held so many positive memories and nostalgia for me. So it wasn't just I was reading a book, I was also revisiting my past. The first book in the series I think is one of the weakest in the whole series, if I do say so myself. My favorites that I've reread so far are definitely the second one, which is The Unusual Suspects, as well as number 6, Magic and Other Misdemeanors. They travel in time in this one. It's a lot of fun. Definitely there were some parts that I was struggling to get through a little bit because, you know, you're an adult and you're like, I know who did it. It's not impressive. I'm not bragging about my detective and mystery solving skills, but you know, you start putting things together way faster than the girls, and also their grandmother, who you would suspect would be better at this gag than the girls, but turns out she's pretty slow too. I will say this, I was so in love with these. I remember writing fan fiction and reading fan fiction for one of the ships in the series, which was like my first experience with fandom. The main ship is Sabrina right there, and Puck, who is the character Puck from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. It's compelling, I'm not gonna lie. I'm still just like, this is a very sweet romance, but it's also very classic boy is mean to girl because boy likes girl, and that's a trope that I think we're kind of, I mean, I would hope we're aging out of a little bit. So that was one part I sometimes found a little tiring or a little even troubling. I remember at the time being like, this love story is top tier, and now I'm like, this might explain some of your choices in romantic partners. So anyway, I am conflicted whether I want to finish the entire series by reading the last 3 books. I might as well. they're a nice lazy read for the days where my brain doesn't want to take in words that are, I don't know, longer than 6 letters. So now that I've talked about all the middle grade that I've read this year, I will talk about the contemporary romance that I read this year. So the first book that I read, and this is the book that I actually read in July before I even started consistently reading again, and that is Beach Read by Emily Henry. This was a pretty popular contemporary romance this year, and I totally see why. Emily Henry's voice and writing style is really good and thoughtful. The book follows the story of January Andrews, who is a pretty established writer of women's fiction, in the point of her life after she has suffered some pretty bad setbacks emotionally. She's had a pretty bad breakup, she is running out of money, and then her dad dies, which is, as you guessed it, pretty awful. In his passing, January has uncovered some of his secrets that he had while he was living, and it completely affects the way that she sees her life, the way that she sees her father, and because she has really no other choice, she's on this book deadline, she has to go back to his cabin, their family lake house, I think it's a lake, to write the book and to pack up the house and sell it. And while she's there dealing with all this stuff, she realizes that the neighbor for the lake house is none only than Augustus Everett, who is a best-selling author that she had a rivalry with in college when they were in the same creative writing program. Ooh, they meet and things happen. I think they actually end up having like this whole little competition slash dare situation where he has to write something with a happy ending and she has to write something like the Great American Novel. This was a solid read. I think I did rate it 5 stars on Goodreads just because anything, especially at that time, that I could manage to finish must have meant it was pretty compelling stuff. The chemistry in this is palpable, which is always satisfying. Sometimes they both did irritate me though. I found January kind of frustrating as a person. You know, it's fine. I wish she would have been able to understand nuance faster, but apparently that's not like her. Call me crazy. Sometimes when there are pieces of media within media, for instance, these two are both writing books that don't actually exist, right? But they're books within a book. That's something that I struggle to really not judge. I found that the things that they were writing sounded bad. Augustus is writing this book about like a cult, and I just couldn't help but be like, that sounds so pretentious, but also like shitty storytelling. It's fine, but like it's just a little thing that bothered me. So maybe in hindsight, I rate it 4 stars out of 5 stars. That's still pretty high. So yeah, Beach Read by Emily Henry, something that I read. The next contemporary romance that I read, which is a cult classic, I think, in the book community, One Day in December by Josie Silver. Ooh. I'm not even gonna lie. This was very good. If I thought Beach Read was addicting, it has really nothing on One Day in December, which is told over several years, right? I'm not sure. It's told over several years, which turns out I think is kind of a light kink of mine. One of my favorite books from when I was still in my teens was One Day by David Nichols. Do we remember that tragic masterpiece? I've never recovered from that story. This kind of follows that same formula, but in a much more lighthearted voice and writing style that feels very classic romantic comedy, which is what I think people gravitate so much to. It feels nostalgic and it feels familiar, even though you clearly haven't been to this world before. It tells the story of Lori and Jack, who have a kind of missed connection. Lori and Jack's eyes meet and lock one day, that of one very snowy day in London, while she is on a, you know, classic red double-decker bus, right? And he is reading a book at the bus stop. She debates whether to get off the bus, he goes to get on the bus, but in a moment of hesitation that lasted a fraction of a second too long, the bus is off and they will never meet. And so we think, no, we didn't think at all, but Lori thinks, and that's what's important. She spends a year looking for him with the help of her best friend, Sarah, and then one day, as I said, a year after the fact, at their annual Christmas party, Sarah wants to introduce Lori to her new boyfriend that she is smitten with, that she thinks might be the one, and of course, bum bum bum, it is the same guy. It's told from both perspectives. There are problems, not gonna lie. Sometimes I found Lori boring. Sometimes I thought she was a bit of, how do you say, a doormat. Sometimes I wanted her to be more aggressive and go after the things that she wanted, not just Jack, but also in terms of her job search. But it's okay, because I think that that's what makes a realistic character. Sometimes it's the stuff that you don't necessarily love. Jack has a moment where he becomes a real asshole in the book, and he loses a lot of my respect. I think that we have a lot of culture of forgiveness and humanization of flaws that maybe need to be less humanized, like people not knowing how to control their anger. That goes for everybody, but specifically I think it's pretty prevalent in romantic relationships with men and women. It's just like, go to therapy, Jack. Stop making this woman take the brunt of all of your issues. Even though there are some things that irk me, there are some things that would make me understand why this book isn't everybody's cup of tea, I could not stop thinking about it when I was reading it. And that for me is like the big takeaway. It also served as great escapism, because I was working like a dog around Thanksgiving season, because working at a bakery means that the holidays are crazy because everybody wants bread. So this was like my safe haven, and I think I'm gonna do what a lot of people do. I think I'm gonna make it like an annual read. I really enjoyed it. I mean, is there an adaptation happening? Do we know? Because it would make a great movie. But it'd have to be like that style, you know, that high caliber Nancy Meyers, Nora Ephron kind of style. If I was in charge, I would make them say their full names less. That's my one suggestion if it's becoming a movie at any point. That's one of my biggest pet peeves in love story love confessions. Who is saying, I love you, first name, last name, I love you too, first name, last name? If someone said, I love you, Aline Duflock, I might just walk away right then and there. Maybe some people like it. Maybe some people like it. It's fine. It's a tiny thing. It's a tiny thing. I really do love it. It's so good. Even with my nitpicking, I would rate this 5 out of 5 stars. And the last contemporary romance that I read this year is One to Watch by Kate Stayman London. This is a book that I bought when I was kind of in a reading slump and having a bit of a blue period. So when I was feeling a little down in the dumps about life, I bought this book because I wanted something light and kind of fluffy to read, something that I'd heard great things about. Also, ooh, it features a plus-size main character, which we don't see that often, especially as a love interest. So I was super excited. This book tells the story of B. Schumacher, who is a prominent fashion blogger who, on a whim, writes a lighthearted / poignant criticism of the show called Main Squeeze, which is a parody of the Bachelor / Bachelorette franchise. If you're not familiar, think roses. And the next thing she knows, that critique has gone viral, and the ratings for the Main Squeeze are going down. The 2 main producers are fired, and she is asked by the new producer to be the next Main Squeeze. So she's asked to essentially be the Bachelorette. So you see, the trap has been set. It's a compelling situation. It very realistically discusses how she's torn between, is this great representation or is this exploitation? And the book essentially tells a story not just from B's perspective a la third-person narrator, but also through different chunks of media, like group chats from the perspective of people who watch the show together, news outlets like TMZ, Reality Steve, who isn't Reality Steve, but we all know is like Reality Steve. So you can kind of get the outside perspective of what's going on, especially what's going on with the men. As I was saying, I was looking for something lighthearted to read. However, I shouldn't have read it when I was in my blue period, because the first quarter / half of the book is this girl feeling kind of shitty about herself and shitty things happening. I couldn't put it down, and it was a really fast read for me, but the first quarter / first half of the book was all about her struggle in feeling like a valid, desirable contestant of this show, which was sometimes hard to read. As somebody who is mid-size and borders on plus size, and who's definitely had a lot of these same feelings, fears, insecurities, part of it felt very, very real. And granted, that's, I guess, is kudos to good character building and really realistic storytelling, but it was sometimes really hard to read and quite triggering, if I'm being honest, because sometimes you're just like, oh, she's voicing all of my greatest fears. But yeah, I do think that she spent maybe a little too much time on that in the beginning, instead of building up Bee as a character to really root for. I wanted to root for her to find love, not just feel bad for her that she didn't have it yet. There is one part of the plot that really bothered me, and I thought was not just unrealistic, but frustratingly so. The way she deals with it is so impersonal to how somebody in her situation would actually handle it / feel. But as a whole, I did really enjoy this book. I had a great time in Bee's world, and it's also honestly just nice to watch somebody who you can relate to on that kind of body level fall in love. This was one that I was so shocked was in the romance section, because obviously it's a romance premise, but I found that even the majority of the book was about her story with herself and not having to do anything with anybody else. Also, reading Kate Stayman London's biography, she's also like a juggernaut in political writing. She was lead digital writer for Hillary Rodham Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and has written from notable figures ranging from Michelle Obama to Malala Yousafzai to Anna Wintour and Cher. So she has range. The next book that I read that some people might consider romance, it's shelved in contemporary fiction. It is Josie Silver's second book, The Two Lives of Lydia Bird. It's essentially about the life of Lydia Bird, who has just lost her longtime love and fiance, Freddie. And while she is grieving, she is prescribed a bottle of pink sleeping pills to help her sleep because she hasn't been sleeping, and she finds out that when she takes a sleeping pill, those sleeps that she goes under have Freddie in them, and essentially her dreams reflect what life would be like if he hadn't died. The way that the dreams work is that they are in live time, and every single time she goes to sleep in the dream, she wakes up in her real life and she has to live life without him all over again. So it's about these two parallel lives that she's living, and essentially how she navigates that, decides if she wants to navigate that at all, and it's really just a story about grief, in all honesty. It did take me a while to get through because, as I said, it is a slow burn story. A lot of it is Lydia's day-to-day and figuring out how to feel like a person again. I really liked the beginning, and I didn't care for the middle, and I loved the end. So if that gives you an idea, I would give it probably 3 or 4 stars. Like, I kid you not, like, don't go into this thinking that it's a love story and you'd have a better time. I wish that that's what I would have done. I think I would have had a much better time if I didn't go into this thinking that this lady with the cute little hair and dress was going to fall in love. It's also beautiful, like, oh my god. She long as well. I was reading it sometimes in bed being like, I wish this was a less tall book, but you know, it's stunning, and when I hold it, I feel pretty. Now it's time for the only adult fantasy that I read, and that is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Last fall, I watched Neil Gaiman's masterclass on masterclass.com and like fiction and storytelling. It's so good. I've been familiar with his work for a while, not in book form, but in adaptation form. I was a huge lover of Stardust, the film, as well as Coraline. Well, actually no, Coraline did traumatize me, but I recently watched it again and it's so good. And so I watched that, I loved it, and then I watched it again and I figured if I'm watching this man speak about the craft of writing so much, I should pick up something that he's actually written. So I picked up Neverwhere because it sounded really compelling. It tells the story of Richard Mayhew, who is a young man living in London when he is on his way to dinner with his fiancée and her boss one night, and he encounters a girl on the street who has been attacked, who is hurt, and she's bleeding out onto the street. He seems to be the only one who's paying her really any kind of attention. His fiance is not really having the same reaction, and against her protests, he ends up taking the young attacked girl home. She begs not to be taken to the hospital, that's why, not because he's being creepy. So he takes her home and he helps keep her safe. And then after that event, after she is healed, after the mysterious girl is gone, nobody in Richard's life remembers him and or sees him. And to try to remedy the situation, Richard goes on a journey to find the girl. It basically takes him on this really gritty Alice in Wonderland-esque journey in the world of London Below, which is the under London world. The world where people and things who fall through the cracks live. I don't know if you can tell, but I really enjoyed this book. It is an urban fantasy. It is very atmospheric in the way that it's written. It's very dark and gritty. It's also pretty violent, if I do say so. This was a book that I loved the beginning, I disliked the middle, and I loved the ending. It was such a page turn in like the last 100 pages. But the middle, I was really bored by. So at first I was conflicted about how to rate it. I think I rated it 3 stars on Goodreads at first, and then I went back and I changed it to 4 because I couldn't stop thinking about it. It does feel like a children's story for adults, if that makes sense. It feels like a children's classic for adults, which I know is what he intended. It says that in like the author's note in the beginning. I do have a couple of complaints about it feeling a little bit outdated since it was published in 1996. There's one stereotype regarding the female character of color that really broke my heart a little bit. If you've read the book, you can probably guess what I'm talking about. Aha, here it is. There's one little aspect that did bother me that felt very #male authors. This is Neil Gaiman describing his main character. He was a fresh-faced, boyish young man with dark, slightly curly hair and large hazel eyes. He had a rumpled, just-woken-up look to him, which made him more attractive to the opposite sex than he could ever understand or believe. And then, you know, you go and look at the Neil Gaiman picture at the back, and I'm like, did this man just describe himself and then was like, women love me? I don't know, but that's how it felt. And if you didn't know anything about Neil Gaiman's social life, yes, he's been with a cool collection of ladies who are, yes, very pretty. But that being said, it felt a little masturbatory to me. But that's just me. Maybe it's just me. But that's fine and very small considering how much I actually love this book, how modern it still felt. I understand why there's a lot of hype around it. So yeah, that's Neverwhere. I would rate this 4 out of 5 stars. I'm really interested in reading more fantasy. Please leave your recommendations down below. So the next 2 books that I read this year are my nonfiction books that I'm going to share with you. This first one being Untamed by Glennon Doyle, which is another Reese's Book Club find. Turns out I'm a real big fan of Reese Witherspoon's taste. I think that Reese Witherspoon has just like the best everything. This book falls in the category of self-help / memoir, and it is the story of Glennon Doyle, who has made the leap from kind of conventional Christian mommy blogger to being in a same-sex relationship and having a very non-conventional blended family. I had never read any of her other books like Love Warrior, so I'm not really familiar with that version of Glennon Doyle. I know that she was very popular and a lot of people resonated with the stuff that she was saying. I know that some Christians still love her more than ever, and I know that some think that she's created this idol of self against God or whatever, but I don't really believe the latter. I don't know if you can tell. I am queer, so I had a blast and a half reading about her love story. It's funny. I know that there are just a lot of queer love stories out there. Never is it not a thrill reading about someone's own personal account, especially since I came out last year. So now more than ever, I feel like I can resonate with these kinds of stories and understand so personally what somebody's talking about. It also has some beautiful essays and poignant reflection about listening to your inner self, listening to your inner child, looking around and thinking to yourself, wasn't life supposed to be more beautiful than this? Ugh. Kids kill me. Like, it felt so restorative for me to read. Yes, there are times where it felt a little bit out there, but I had the same kind of experience reading Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, where some of the stuff seems a little bit of a reach for me, but most of the stuff really hits home, really hits the nail on the head, and makes me feel understood in a lot of ways that I couldn't articulate beforehand, especially when it came to honoring your childlike self, especially when it came to things about women performing after a certain point in their life instead of listening to their inner self. I would highly recommend this one. It was a birthday present from one of my best friends, Whitney, and she left it on my doorstep during the pandemic, and it was really needed, and I love her. It was a very personal and thoughtful gift. It has to be 5 out of 5 stars for me. My throat is getting scratchy. And lastly, the last physical book that I read is one that I am about 50 pages out from finishing, but I wanted to include it in my 2020 books read because I felt like cheating to include it with my 2021 books. And that is Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence by Kristen R. Godsey. I picked this up when I was still performing the role of person who reads books. I would go to the bookstore and spend like $60 on books, and books like this, like political theory, that it's like, honey, you haven't read a fairy tale since you were 15. What do you think you're gonna do with this? It has taken me a while to get through, just because when I read nonfiction, I do like to annotate my nonfiction, which yes, sometimes makes me feel a little douchey, a little Jess Mariano, if you will, but that is the way that I have come to really read nonfiction, because that's the way that it sticks in my head. The preface to the paperback edition is pretty dense, so that was the first part that I read, and I think it was a misrepresentation of how accessible this text is. I don't think that somebody could automatically go from I don't read to let me read this book, but that being said, it is really well written. She has a very sharp way of connecting thoughts together and creating little mini essays that flow so well from one point to another, from one country to another, from one time period to another. It is so good. I find myself reaching for this so often. Maybe some people might be a little shocked by the title, but I just want to clarify that this book is a conversation and comparison of gender politics in capitalist societies versus socialist societies, and it is so nuanced. I don't want to hear anybody saying that I'm reading socialist propaganda. This book has so many shades of gray within the discussion. I learned criticisms of socialist countries that I had never even thought of, that I never would have even thought to look up if it wasn't for this book. I learned about issues that face countries like Finland, who we never even think of Finland having any flaws. The author did a disclaimer about gender in the preface, which I thought was incredibly modern for somebody who did the brunt of their research in the 80s. I loved it. I'm gonna read you the table of contents just because I want to give you an idea of Godsey's voice and the way that she frames her arguments. Introduction: you might be suffering from capitalism. 1. Women, like men, but cheaper, on work. 2. What to expect when you're expecting exploitation, on motherhood. 3. Pantsuits are not enough, on leadership. 4. Capitalism between the sheets, on sex, part 1. 5. To each according to her needs, on sex, part 2. 6. From barricades to ballot boxes, on citizenship. I learned things that we just don't learn about in the American school system. I was shocked. If you want to give this a read, that's there. I would give this 5 out of 5 stars. Easy. I also listened to the first 4 of the Harry Potter audiobooks. They are available for free, questionably so, on the podcast app. They are under the banner of audiobooks in this audiobook show. I don't know why I'm whispering like J.K. Rowling can hear me. There's a quote in one of the books that's just like, it doesn't matter what somebody's born but who they grow to be. It's like she was this close to the point, you know? Whatever. But I have been trying to subvert some of my money going directly to her as a Harry Potter fan. If you want to look up the audiobook, hopefully it's still there and doesn't get taken down. It looks like this. You can have a go at it if you like. I'm Aline Duflock. Thank you. It is so dark now. My voice is hoarse.